Hi.
Hello.
Technical difficulty.
It's quite all right. Um, I think the more we do these things on the internet, on the stage for everyone to see, I think the more the general public is getting pretty comfortable with the fact that these things can happen, and it's not really a big deal. People
Yeah,
are fairly forgiving of how the internet works.
thank goodness, because otherwise. So we'll just see who we've got here. Hello, everyone who's joining. You can please add a comment if, like, tell us where you're from. That'd be really interesting. With the Musica Sacra project, it seems like it's going pretty international, which is really cool. But yeah, and if you don't have time to be listening today, I'll just post this up and it should be on the feed later. Again, if technical difficulties are okay. Um, so it's live now, but hopefully accessible later too. So, hello, Oliver.
Hello,
Can
Grace.
you please let everyone know a little bit about yourself and why I've got you on here, I guess, because obviously we're both sacred musicians.
Yes, well, I'm from Lafayette, Louisiana, and I grew up in a culture where a lot of the musical norm in the Mass was very much the stereotypical American spirit of Vatican II, where every other church you walk into, you ask, "Where's the tabernacle?" And the music is all varieties, mostly guitar, sometimes drum sets, and the like. And not to denigrate the way that that could move people personally. I found that that just wasn't really, there was always something inside of me that knew it wasn't quite it for that space and that setting. And the first time I went to a mass when I was a child, where I heard the organ well played, it was at the cathedral in my hometown. Really, really nice, lovely organ, and a really, really world-class organist who's been there since before I was born. And to hear the organ played so well in the mass really bit the bug bit, so to speak, and that's where from my love of music and the liturgy developed. And it was kind of a double-edged sword because that's what started to strengthen my faith as well. And so it had this circling effect where one fed the other and vice versa.
That's really cool. And so then, where did you go on to study? Give us a bit of background.
Sure. Well, I spread my undergraduate studies out across three different schools because I only started playing the organ, studying it really when I was 18. And so the first school I was there on a bassoon scholarship, and it was just like an exorbitant tuition, and I had to leave for that reason. Didn't have any time or energy to study the organ. The second place was actually a pretty decent program, but there were some social problems in the school that left me feeling rather um, at odds. And so I took some time off to regroup and like ask myself, do I really want to do this? And then I found another school, which is Northwestern State University in northern Louisiana, that had a really decent teacher, an okay program, and I just wanted to finish it and regroup and like, do I want to go into further studies for another degree? Um, it seems to be more often than not that, especially with performance schools in the US, a lot of people follow this route of, well, if I can't get into a top conservatory at an undergraduate level, I'll go somewhere maybe that's just as good, but not maybe in as vogue, and do the work and just try it for the next degree. And it worked for me.
That's
And now I'm finishing my master's degree at the Eastman School of Music. I study with David Higgs. He's great. The sacred music program here is really more. Um, they give you special attention in your formation, but you have to really know what you're looking for them to meet you halfway. And it's been a very informative and humbling process.
awesome. And you are music director where?
So I'm the director of music and organist at a Catholic church in a few towns outside of Rochester. So Rochester is the seat of the Diocese of Rochester. It's where Fulton Sheen was the Archbishop for a while. And a few towns out, there's actually a shortage of priests in this diocese, and so it's very common, especially the further out from the big city you get, where you've got maybe one parish that manages multiple locations. And so I play for this parish that is out in a rural community, and there are three different churches in three neighboring small towns. And so apart from my Saturday Mass, I have three Masses back to back on Sunday morning, and I just commute from each one. It's the same priest, and so all two of us are busy with all three locations. And so, um, and I was brought in because he wanted some consistency with the music, and it's been an opportunity for me to develop a set of leadership skills as a director that I wasn't really groomed for. But God has a way to called in such a way where if you find yourself in that position, things really work out. And there were a lot of things that I owe to the pandemic, really, because we were at a point where no one was really singing because they weren't really supposed to. And it gave us kind of an opportunity to reset, because he brought me in because there was just inconsistent music at all of these locations with differing abilities from the musicians, different song selections, different degrees of what's appropriate. And he's a very traditionally inclined priest in his late 30s, so you can kind of deduce what direction he wanted to head. And it was just kind of a right time at the right place kind of thing where, well, no one's singing, so this is an opportunity to kind of control, alt, delete, reboot, and build from the ground up and let them hear it done first. And that way, if and when they're able to sing again, they'll kind of have it in their head a little bit, in their ear, so they'll know what to do. And so when I started out with traditional hymnody, even I was getting some angry emails from parishioners who liked things done a certain way, and I was very gracious in responding, but I held firm because I knew, like, this is the only way this is going to work. Is if we just do it and are very diplomatic in soothing hurt feelings without compromising what is true to the rubrics. Because often I think the compromising what's true to the rubrics lends itself to varying degrees of liturgical abuse, certainly with regards to the music. And having this window was a good bedrock. And then we started including more sung propers. Some of even recently we started singing a lot more Gregorian chant in the Novus Ordo Mass, which is kind of unheard of, especially in the United States and a lot of places.
I think it's growing, but yes. It is rare. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then for a rural parish, it's definitely, you're hard pressed to find that.
Yeah.
And because I was the director, I kind of had freedom to just try all sorts of things. Like when you try something, as long as you have the humility to admit when you could be wrong, you could do quite a lot. I mean, that's usually how most discoveries are made anyway. And I was willing to look like an idiot and let some parishioners hate me if that's what it took. But we've gotten to the point where we usually sing almost all the verses of whatever hymn. Usually it's four hymns, so an opening hymn, offertory hymn, communion hymn, and a recessional hymn. And almost always we sing all the verses, which is unheard of in the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
At least in the US, we have a reputation for not only not singing, but half singing half of the hymn.
Yeah.
And
world over, not just the US.
And I remember I was walking to my car once after a Mass, and we had sung the entire hymn. And there was a parishioner who I think he was a Vietnam vet, and he was feeling rather winded, and he was in his truck, and his wife was in the passenger seat, and he rolled down the window and he like beckoned me over. And like if you're younger, you just kind of you play along because you're like, I have no idea what they're going to say, but I just have to nod and say yes sir, no sir, depending on what it is. And I mean, he was just like, hey, why do you sing all the verses? I'm like out of breath. And I just thought about it, and I said, well, Do you say half of an Our Father? Do you say half of a Hail Mary? Do you get to the end of the offertory and call it a day? And I saw the light go off in his head, and it was so cool. Where I knew I could say it that way with him, but I saw the light go off in his head, and he just kind of goes, point taken. And I've never, whenever if you explain it the right way to the right person, you meet them halfway where they are, they're usually extremely on board. Because most of these people just don't know any better, and you can't beat them over the head with a stick, and you can't treat them like they're stupid because they're not. And as long as you meet them halfway, they're usually very, very sporting. Um,
Yeah, it's
Provided you
partly
play the
just
cards right.
education. I
Yes.
mean, that's why I
Hmm.
started this whole thing,
Hmm.
was that people do appreciate when you know, just like I started appreciating more when
Hmm.
I knew more. It's just a natural progression. So I think, yeah, treating people like they're stupid or they don't know what's going on, well, they generally don't know. So it's fair
Yeah.
enough.
And it's
That
a great,
education.
well, yeah, yeah. And it's a great opportunity to practice some humility in separating maybe a disdain for ignorance from the people who may hold it. Because it's not, I mean, it's not good pedagogy if you've ever had a teacher who makes you feel stupid for not knowing something. And you do take on the role of a teacher whenever you're in that position, like it or not. And so you have to do a lot of learning on your own so that you can bring that to the table. And you've got to be able to roll with the punches in such a way where if they're off put by something they don't know, you can navigate that in such a way where you can lead the horse to water and invite him to drink it.
Yeah,
Um,
that's so cool.
yeah.
Oh, it's really good. Thank you. Thank you for the background.
Hmm.
Um, I guess why I got you on here today and to keep things rolling was it popped on into my head on Ash Wednesday how the organ is suppressed now during Lent and we keep it very subdued. Um, Firstly, I wanted an organist's perspective of how do you keep the liturgy beautiful while keeping the organ, more in the background. But then you've had a lot of success with your congregation and getting them to sing.
Hmm.
And oftentimes a good rowdy organ is a fantastic way. How, like, does your congregation still participate equally, or are there some tactics during Lent to keep them singing like they do through Christmas or Easter? Yeah, so I just wanted to sort of chat about that from a director and organist perspective as opposed to a singer. So,
Sure. Well, one thing I've learned, especially at this parish, is that you can make anything beautiful. And with Lent, the rubrics officially state, the organ should be silent unless to accompany singing, with the exception being Laetare Sunday. So there's no preludes, there's no postludes, there's no instrumental music, there's no improvisational noodling during the Mass where needed, where I would otherwise do it. Um, and as long as you approach the musicianship from a place of the spirituality aspect, that's what's going to make it effective. So if you approach it within the culture of the Mass must be more stark, so that you can sense that there's something not quite here yet. That that has a way of letting the difference in music still point people towards the altar pretty effectively. Um, so I try to have a healthy balance of what's accessible and still expose them to things that I think that every Catholic ought to know musically, at least in the confines of our own liturgical culture. So one thing that I started doing last May, because May is a month of Mary, every Sunday in May last year was in the Easter season, and so I thought it would be clever to expose them to the seasonal Marian antiphon by making that the closing hymn for Mass every week. Because if you repeat something way too much, then people just hate it. But if you do it just 4 or 5 weeks, then it's like, oh, I recognize that and that was effective, and it's not a terribly long antiphon. It's the Regina Caeli, and so that was the closing hymn. And so I would just play through it once, and then cantor it, and it got to the point where they were singing over the organ. Like there's actually a video on my Instagram from last May where you can see it.
Yeah, I remember.
Um,
Yeah.
and there were some pragmatic compromises, especially with the way you accompany Gregorian chant, that that I found worked. Like if people are only used to singing hymns in metric diatonic structure, I found that some proper voice leading where necessary was appropriate. I usually just improvise the accompaniments. Um, Usually those would be more modal because of how chant works. It
Yeah.
lends itself to that device anyway, but I found that adding some diatonic elements where necessary, especially with cadences, was extremely effective because then it felt a little more hymn-like to where they knew something they didn't know, and
Yeah.
in,
To
and
interject,
mhm.
just recently I heard it was the organist was keeping to the modal style, and it did not help. And I remember you talking about this, and I realized, yes, you're quite correct. And I realized some of the previous organists that I've used, worked with, did the same process of diatonic, and it does. It assists the congregation. They were quite lost
Yeah.
otherwise,
Mhm.
I would say. Yeah.
And so
Continue. Sorry.
oh, it's all right. Well, and it goes to show that there has always been, at least in the last 100 years, a gap widening between what the general public knows about music and what the educated musicians know about music. And the hard part for people who, the more educated they get as musicians, the hardest challenge is to how do I still make this accessible and meet people halfway so that people are invited to find the things in it that I've found in it. And so it, I think it's perfectly within the scope of what's acceptable to invite people by adding elements of diatonic accompaniment, especially with at least this case. And with with Lent, the antiphon is the Ave Regina Caelorum, and so what we did in Advent with the Alma Redemptoris Mater is the same thing we're doing with the Ave Regina Caelorum, where we just use that as the offertory because it's a smaller season relatively. It's not all of ordinary time up until Advent, and so you can do it for about 5 or 6 weeks before people finally get tired of it, and so Lent's perfect. And so offertory, that's what we use, and that time I do just play through it on the organ very softly, and I support it while we sing it, and I sing while I play, and so they can hear it, and so they're supported no matter what. Um,
And
and
what are the um, mass parts like are you using during Lent?
well, during Lent, we had tried all sorts of things. Last Easter we used the Missa de Angelus, and we used it all the way up until the start of Advent. And
Cool.
unfortunately, it was just to the chagrin of too many people who had never sung Gregorian chant, and they just resented uh, the feeling of being alienated, which is understandable. And so I had to look for a metered, like choral-like mass setting in its place. And I found a few that I really like, and I don't really like most of them, but that's a subjective thing. Um, but I found a few that were not really, really quite good. And so one I liked, but they just didn't like because it was just in a high enough range to where it was just a bit of a stretch. And
Mm-hmm.
like, the average Joe can really sing up to a D in the treble clef or a D in the underneath the
Max.
treble clef. Yeah,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, and that, but there were a lot of those, and so that's just enough to be uncomfortable. And so we started using a mass by Jan Vermulst, the Master Christian Unity, which is not terrible. It was the first one I ever learned when I had a church job. It was accessible. It's short and sweet, and it's respectable. It's not like the My Little Pony mass that a lot of people know. I think what's that one called? The Mass of Christ the Savior. Um,
Yeah, you guys use different math settings to the ones in Australia, so I have to learn all the American ones as well.
yeah. But so we were using that one, and then when Lent came around, I thought it would be nice to just use the Missa Primitava, um, the same chants that you would use in the Requiem. But there's an English chant mass that's set to those, and um, Lent is the time to do it, where it's appropriate within reason. It's more solemn, and it introduces a congregation to the Gregorian chant style, where um, it's accessible enough, and people are strangely very, very familiar with that one because that's usually been the de facto anywhere I've been in the U.S. where anytime they want to use Gregorian chant, that's the one they default to, and so it's just in everyone's ear, and so it was a nice way to do this where they could participate, and it was still contributing to the more stark and solemn and somber effect of music and Lent. There's an opening hymn and a closing hymn. Almost always the verses are all sung. All the verses are sung, I mean, with just very simple organ accompaniment. The organ isn't too loud. Um, One thing that I've discovered is that where you are regionally affects what they like from the organ's participation. And you can trace that back to how different pockets of Christianity came out of Europe and how those organs developed. Like in northern Germany, in the Lutheran Church, the organ was much more of a minister and a leader. And so the organs are bigger and louder, fuller sounds, brighter, mixture heavy. Where you go to southern Germany, the organ's more supportive, and it wasn't supporting singing like it was in northern Germany. But even in like the Moravian Church, the organ is much more supportive rather than leadership, and you can do both of those things effectively depending on the time and the place. And I've found ways to lead from the organ when it's appropriate, and ways to support from the organ where it's appropriate. And there's been grace periods of trial and error within reason because you still have to do the job well. But there's definitely Lent. I definitely make the organ much more supportive than leader, and
And
I
does
found
the
that.
congregation still sing? Like they sing well?
Mhm.
That's
Yeah,
good.
yeah. I mean, I make it a point to. I've built up a good repertoire of appropriate hymns, and they know them well enough to where now they can participate very well. Like they're not. There's no guessing anymore. And because the music has been standardized at my parish, I often see maybe one family that normally goes to one mass going to a different one because now they can, because they couldn't always do that because they would get used to it done a certain way at one, and then
Um,
they would go to one of the other locations and just like, what is going on? Um, and so if you do things consistently for long enough, people kind of learn the scope of what to expect, and they they participate. The Ave Regina Chilorum is still a little fresh, but I I I think give it a couple of weeks and they'll catch on. For
yeah.
communion, what I do to make a point of the difference is instead of a hymn for communion, I sing the proper with some verses and a Gloria Patri, and like it would have been done in a Latin Mass, where there's the antiphon and the verses and everything, and then there's no instrumental music afterwards while the communion ends, and I just let that be it.
Mm,
And
that's nice.
usually people aren't really singing along during communion anyway, and so it's nice to let them hear that there is a difference, and it does contribute to the bare boneness of the season. And I just so far have had nothing but really decent feedback, and it's a ministerial effect just as much as a musical one.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I think that's clocked almost half an hour. So
Oh wow.
we should give it a wrap. But thank you so much for getting on and sharing that with me. And everyone watching, if you watch, please let me know if you'd like more of these sort of sessions with a variety of people. And we can get Oliver back on as well and chat about something else. So hopefully this can be one of more to come. And yeah, thank you, Oliver,
Thank
and have
you,
a good
Grace.
Saturday. I know you have your vigil mass soon, so I appreciate your time.
Certainly.
Okay,
Thank you so much
thanks.
for having me. Goodbye.
No worries. Thank you, everyone, and see you soon.